Welcome to our Winter Newman Lecture, Science, Faith, and Happiness with Dr. Christopher Kazar. Whether you are a student, faculty member, or a member of the larger community, we want to thank you for coming out tonight. My name is Isaiah Rodriguez, and I'm a volunteer missionary at the Newman Center. Here beside me is Charlotte Simpson. And before we get started, we just wanted to introduce ourselves. So I graduated last spring from OSU with a degree in biomedical sciences and medical humanities.
And as Isaiah said, my name is Charlotte. I graduated last spring from American Universities with my master's in justice and law. Currently, I work with Isaiah as a volunteer missionary at the Oregon State Newman Center. I've been attending Newman lectures for the past 4 years, both online webinars and in person at American University. Through this series, I have received so much knowledge that has expanded my worldview and deepened my understanding of Christianity, the church, and my own faith. Exposure to intellectual formation is so important, and these lectures have provided me with opportunities to explore the big questions of life and topics I wouldn't have otherwise been exposed to.
We would especially like to welcome anyone who is here for their first Newman lecture. Dr. Kazar is one of a number of great speakers who come to Oregon State for discussions on urgent topics and thought-provoking topics surrounding matters of philosophy, social issues, and religious beliefs. Through these lectures and participant questions, I hope we can all grow in a greater understanding of these philosophers and learn from one another.
I'd just like to take a moment to explain how the night will go. Dr. Kazar will speak for about 45 minutes, and following the presentation, there will be time for questions. Isaiah and I will be at the front of these two aisles with microphones, and we'll prompt you when it's your turn to ask a question. We welcome all questions. However, for the sake of time, and so that we can get to as many people as possible, we request that you ask only one question and remain succinct and to the point. And now, the director of the Newman Center, Father John, will introduce our speaker.
So on behalf of the Newman Center at Oregon State University, welcome to this new edition of the Newman Lectures. The Newman Lectures aim to foster an important discussion between faith and reason, between faith and the university. John Henry Newman used to say that one of the greatest richness of university education should be to offer a space for the interaction among different areas of knowledge within an organic education. It means putting students in contact with universal knowledge. That's where the name university comes from. We must not reduce knowledge and education just to our own area of interest or expertise. A liberal education that creates dialogue between different sciences truly helps the enlargement of the mind. And this is the goal of the Newman Lectures, to help the enlargement of our minds. That is why I think this lecture in particular we are having this evening regarding the dialogue between science, faith, and the pursuit of happiness fits so well into this vision of the Newman Lectures. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Kazar for his willingness to reschedule this lecture last minute because of the ice storm 2 weeks ago. And I will now introduce Dr. Kazar. So, Dr. Christopher Kazar is chair of the Department of Philosophy at Loyola Marymount University and the St. Thomas Aquinas Fellow for the Renewal of Catholic Intellectual Life at Bishop Barron's Word on Fire Institute. He is the author of 16 books, and his research on issues of ethics, philosophy, and religion has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, NPR, and EWTN. So welcome, Dr. Kazar.
All right, thank you, Father John. It's so nice to hear kind words reading off these things I've done and stuff, and it reminds me of a time where I was trying to get a compliment from my kids. So I had been exercising and getting back into running, and I lost all this weight, and I got down to just 3 pounds more than I did when I was a senior in high school. So I had the kids around, and I said, kids, you know what? I only weigh 3 pounds more than I did when I was a senior in high school. And my daughter looked at me and she said, "Oh my gosh, Dad, you were that fat in high school?" So that didn't work out so well. But your family really can inform your life. And so I want to start off with a story today, not of happiness, but of the worst time in my whole life. And the worst time in my whole life was almost exactly 16 years ago. We had moved to Washington, D.C. from Los Angeles, and this was really my dream job. So I had a 40% raise in salary, and I was on the academic leadership committee, and it just was fantastic. We got a new parish, and I loved that. I had made all these new friends, and I loved that. And it was just absolutely great. The only trouble was this: my wife hated it. She hated DC. And every day I'd come home and hope that she'd be happy and enjoying it. And every day was the same, she was hating it. And so I thought, this is just terrible. So I thought, okay, well, what I'll do is I'll start to pray that somehow God will arrange things so that she will really like it. So I started to pray a lot, nothing happened. And I said, okay, well, maybe I should pretend like it's Lent. You know, undertake some Lenten sacrifices for this intention. God, please help my wife to like DC. So I started to do that. Nothing. I thought, all right, well, maybe I should get some people that are holier than I am to pray for this with me. So some of my friends, we did this novena for this intention. Nothing. So finally I went to my wife and I said, honey, you know, I just want to let you know, I have been praying a lot that you will start to like Washington, D.C., and, you know, we can stay here. And she said to me, well, that's very interesting. Have you asked God what God wants? And I thought, no, I haven't done that. And then after our conversation, I was afraid to do that. So a week went by, and I'm not going to pray about this. I know what I want. I know what's best. A couple of weeks go by, about 3 weeks go by. Finally, I thought to myself, well, God is all good. God is all knowing. Maybe I should consult, just check in, and maybe see if this should be a good idea. And basically right away, after I did pray about what does God want, I felt like God did want us to go back to DC. So I didn't want to accept that answer though. So I went around and I talked to a bunch of people I really respected, people that are very experienced, holy, good people, far along in the spiritual life, and I kind of put the whole thing before them, and then they all agreed, yeah, we should go back to DC, or back to Los Angeles. So I went back to Los Angeles. And I'd like to tell you that when I got back to Los Angeles, I was a fantastic husband, a fantastic dad. I had a big smile on my face, everything was great. But it wasn't, that wasn't what happened at all. I was miserable. I was totally unhappy. I took a 30% pay cut to go back. I had lost all my new friends that I loved so much. Wasn't in the academic leadership council anymore. Everything was reversal on multiple fronts. I had a friend, I was at this one event, kind of pouring out my heart how sad I was to be back and stuff, and an acquaintance of ours walked over and said, Chris, hey, welcome back to Los Angeles. Are you happy to be here? And I said to him, I can't tell you how happy I am to be here. So I don't think he understood it quite the way I intended it. But anyway, so I was miserable. And so I did what any scholar would do. You know, I've got a PhD, study Aquinas, so I have this big question. So what do? I go to Google. How to be more happy. Googled it. And up popped a number of results for something called positive psychology. Just raise your hand. Have you ever heard of this term, positive psychology? A lot of people have. Okay, good. So if you haven't heard of it, positive psychology is a relatively recent movement in psychology founded by a University of Pennsylvania professor named Martin Seligman. And what Seligman noted was that psychology, for the vast majority of its history, focused on negative things like depression, anxiety, bipolar, all these problems. And those are problems that psychology should look at and try to fix. But he said there's another side to the human experience that psychology really has not explored very much. And that would be what is positive. So things like optimism, things like resilience, things like strengths that help you to do well in life, things like gratitude, things like forgiveness. There's almost no empirical research on these topics. And so, at Seligman's prompting, psychology, at least a number of psychologists, turned to begin to look at these positive things. What can make us more happy? And they found a lot of interesting things, and I was very interested and surprised to learn about these things. So the very first thing I learned was about the power of gratitude. So they did a study of people that were moderately depressed, not severely depressed, but moderately depressed. And they recommended to these people that every single night, before they go to sleep, they write down 3 or 4 things for which they're grateful, for things that happened in that day. It doesn't have to be a huge thing, winning the lottery or something, but little things, right? Like a good meal, like a good conversation with a friend, like reading an interesting book, like taking a beautiful walk outside in the forest. Something can be small, but something beautiful and good for which they're grateful. And what they found is that people who did this after a month, about 90% of them reported significant lessening of their symptoms of depression. They felt better. And when I read about this study, I thought, well, isn't it interesting? They've actually run across something that St. Ignatius of Loyola recommended to people who came to him for spiritual direction. St. Ignatius talked about something called the examen. And what he said is, at the end of the day, think about your whole day and think about whatever blessings God has given to you in that day. And be grateful to God for those things. So St. Ignatius was 500 or so years before these positive psychologists. And these scholars, I should point out, are not, for the most part, believing Christians. These are mostly agnostic people. They're not, committed Catholics that are trying to, rediscover St. Ignatius of Loyola or something. So I got to reading about positive psychology. And here's another thing that I ran across. They said that one of the key things for your happiness is forgiveness. Forgiveness is absolutely key. And there's a number of psychological ways of pursuing forgiveness, but people who don't have forgiveness don't have any long-term relationships. Because you guys know, you've lived long enough to know, that everyone is imperfect. Even good people that are trying to be loving and kind are going to do things that irritate you, things that hurt your feelings, they're going to step on your foot, they're going to say the wrong thing and insult you. This just happens in every human relationship. So what happens if you have unforgiveness? Well, you just say, that's it, I'm not talking to Father John anymore. He said this thing to me and I can't believe it, that's it, he's out of here. And I'm not talking to Colette, I'm not talking to Jim, and you just mark people out of your life. And you can do that. But what that means is you're going to have no long-term relationships with your family and friends. And that is going to greatly impoverish your life. So, in order to be more happy, the psychologists say we need to forgive other people. And I thought to myself, well, that's interesting. Have I ever heard that idea before? I thought, yeah, as a matter of fact, I have. There was a guy named Jesus of Nazareth who talked a lot about forgiveness. You may recall this famous prayer that he had called the Our Father, right in the middle of it. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. You might recall that St. Peter came to him and said, Lord, how many times do we have to forgive? 7 times? And that was being generous because the ancient rabbis thought you only have to forgive someone 3 times. And if they do it again the 4th time, that's it. So Peter, being generous, said, well, how about 7 times? And Jesus famously said, no, 7 times, 70 times. And that's symbolic of unlimited, right? He doesn't mean 140 times and then that's it. So forgiveness, absolutely key. And Jesus didn't just talk about forgiveness. When Jesus was getting crucified and was dying, one of his very last words was, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. So Jesus practiced what he preached. And the secular psychologists said this is a key pathway to happiness. Now you might say, what do the secular psychologists mean by happiness? Well, their definition of happiness, or at least Seligman's, is captured by 5 different elements. The first is positive emotion. People who feel up, feel joyful. And this is sort of an obvious sort of point, but positive emotion is for Seligman a key part of happiness, but not the only part of happiness. As we'll see, there's some objective parts of happiness for Seligman. Now, the literature on positive emotion and religious practice is very interesting. Freud thought that people who practice religion would become unhappy and have more psychological problems, but the actual empirical data show just the reverse. People who practice their faith have fewer symptoms of depression, are less likely to commit suicide, are less likely to abuse drugs and alcohol. In fact, the Los Angeles Times talked about a study recently that showed that there was one group of people in this big, huge study that had 0 cases of suicide. And it was women who went to church more than once a week. 0 cases. Very striking. So the practice of religious faith is something that enhances our well-being. And you can see why. If part of our well-being is going to be enhanced by gratitude, and part of our well-being is going to be enhanced by forgiveness, those are the sort of messages that you're going to receive if you go to a religious service, at least a normal one. Right? You're going to hear those messages, those positive messages. In fact, every single Mass is a chance to give gratitude. You may not know, but the Greek word for Thanksgiving is Eucharist. So every Eucharist is a chance to give thanks. And in the United States, I learned when I was working on a book that there's one day of the year on which the fewest number of people commit suicide. And it's Thanksgiving Day. And you probably can see why. Because on Thanksgiving Day in the United States, more people than normal express gratitude. Rather than thinking about the things they don't have, they're grateful for the great goods that they do have. Right? Family, friends, a meal, watching football on TV, whatever it is they're grateful for, they focus on that. So the first part of happiness for Seligman is positive emotion. The second part of happiness for Seligman is engagement. This is also called in the psychological literature flow. The idea here is doing activities that take you out of yourself, activities in which time seems to stop. So maybe for some of you, it's canoeing on a river or something, or hiking in a mountain, or maybe it's playing basketball. But the idea is, whatever your activity is, you can do this activity for an hour, hour and a half, and it feels like only maybe 10 or 15 minutes has gone by. You're totally engaged. You're totally in the moment, right? And that's this idea of flow and engagement. The third part of Seligman's happiness recipe is meaning. And what meaning is making a contribution to a greater good, doing something beyond yourself. So this is something distinctive from positive emotion. So you can have great meaning and yet not have a lot of positive emotion. So he gives it as an example, Winston Churchill. So in fighting Nazis during World War II, obviously Churchill had an enormous positive contribution to the greater good. But Churchill also struggled with melancholy. Abraham Lincoln's a similar situation, right? Did enormous good in the time of the Civil War, and yet also struggled with what he called the darkness that hit his soul. So meaning, though, is making a positive difference. And one of the great things about Christian teaching is that it teaches that everyone can have meaning. You do not need to fight World War II or the Civil War or be a president or be a prime minister. All of us, every day, have opportunities to make other people's lives just a little bit better. If you live with anyone else, you can always pitch in and help out and make their lives better, right? Do the dishes, to be friendly with them, to listen to them when they complain, to run an errand for them. There's always things that we can do to make other people's lives better. So we have meaning. The key, though, for Seligman is relationship. That's really the heart of happiness. There's a famous study at Harvard University called the Grant Study, and it began with undergraduates in college, and it studied them year after year all the way until their deaths. So some of them died in their 90s. So this study ran for some 70 years. And the Grant Study looked at human flourishing, what actually made a difference in people's lives to make their lives better. And what they found was it wasn't money, it wasn't power, it wasn't fame. What ultimately mattered were relationships. The lead researcher of the grant study said, when asked about the study, he defined happiness in the following way. He said, happiness is love, full stop. Happiness is love, full stop. We can have lots and lots of money and yet have no happiness. And you might say, yeah, of course you're saying that. But there's actually empirical research on that. I learned that from the positive psychology folks. They've studied people who make lots of money. And some of them are happy and some of them are not. It is true, money can make an enormous difference for happiness if you're extremely poor. So for instance, let's say you don't eat 3 meals a day, or you don't have warm clothes and you're like shivering outside, or you have nowhere to sleep and so you're sleeping in an alley somewhere. Well, yes, if you get more money and you eat 3 meals a day and you've got clothes to keep you warm and you've got a bed to sleep in, that will make you significantly more happy. But basically what they found is after your basic needs are met, increases in money have no significant difference. There's a chart, if I had a chart here, I'd show it to you, that shows the average income of people in the United States from 1950 through about the year 2000. And what you find is the average income of Americans getting higher and higher. So in 1950, the average family would have 1 car. Americans now, average family is going to have 2, 3, maybe even 4 cars. Average family in 1950 has 1 black and white TV. Average American family now has color TVs, iPhones, all kinds of stuff. So on average, we as a country are significantly more wealthy than we were in 1950. But the percentage of people that report being very happy is completely a flat line. It has not changed at all. It's about 7% since 1950. So all this money, all the iPhones, all the TVs, all the cars, bigger houses, doesn't make any difference for happiness. The last part of happiness for Seligman is achievement. And this is basically achieving your own goals. So I don't know if you have a to-do list. Maybe every day you make up a little list. You say, okay, I go to the laundry and read this chapter or prepare for this test or whatever. And you feel, at least I feel always, a sense of accomplishment if I can get through my to-do list. Like, yeah, all right, I did it. And that is part of human happiness, is achievement, right? Setting goals and achieving them. Now, this multifaceted understanding of happiness can be remembered through the acronym PERMA. Positive emotion, engagement, relationship, meaning, and achievement. PERMA. And PERMA is something that people who are people of faith can have, and often on average have it more, but also people who don't have any faith can also have. There's nothing necessary about faith, having faith to say having these characteristics, right? You could have positive emotion, engagement, relationship, meaning, and achievement, and be agnostic, let's say. So you might say, well, if that's true, what difference, if any, does faith make? And I think it actually does make a difference in a number of ways. The first way is in terms of meaning. If God doesn't exist, then our meaning is necessarily finite. Our meaning does not continue, and in fact, our meaning is truncated. Only if God exists do our actions now have a permanent meaning. Because if God doesn't exist, then whether we're Mother Teresa or Hitler, whether we're a fantastic person that makes the world way better or a person that makes the world way worse, either way, our influence on the world is going to be very limited and eventually end up not being there at all. Scientists tell us the sun at some point is going to supernova and there won't be any more people. So our meaning is limited if there's really no God. We can't have lasting meaning. But of course, if there is a God, well then we can have this lasting meaning. So it makes a positive difference that way. It also makes a positive difference in terms of love. If God exists, then ultimately the universe is ordered by love. And anyone who's on the side of love is on the side of an unstoppable and ultimate power. And this makes a difference because we can think about these different values and say, well, should I aim for positive emotion? Should I aim for achievement? Should I aim for meaning? There's all these different options. But if the Christian view is right, the most important option of all is love. And I shouldn't, for instance, in my work as a professor, try to aim for achievement if this gets in the way and undermines love. And that's true of whatever profession you end up being in, right? You can work so hard and dedicate yourself so hard to your career that you don't have time for your friends and family, that you neglect the kind of duties and responsibilities you have towards others. Well, in the Christian story, that would be a mistake, because love ultimately is the most important of all. So it gives a kind of orbit to Seligman's PERMA. In addition, and most importantly, positive psychology has nothing to say about the reality of death. So death is the destruction of PERMA, right? There's no more positive emotion when you're dead, right? No more engagement, no more relationship, no more meaning, no more achievement, and there's no answer. But of course, for Christians, we have the hope of the resurrection. And so we have the hope that death is not the final word, that like Jesus, we too will someday enjoy eternal life. And finally, positive psychology also doesn't answer the question of the deepest desires of the human heart. So we want lots of things, but everyone desires the truth. Aristotle talked about this, and he said, all people by nature desire to know. But the kinds of truths that we can know, even at a great university like this, are very limited and partial. Even your most learned professors will be the first to tell you they have much to learn. They don't know everything they need to know or want to know. So our knowledge of truth is always limited. And not only do we want truth, we want goodness. But that too is limited. If we consider ourselves, we see that we're not perfectly good, and even our friends and people in our family, they're not perfectly good, and yet we seek out goodness naturally. And yet we can't seem to find any perfect good here below. And most of all, we seek love. But all human love is likewise limited. Even think of a married couple that's married 60, 70 years. Well, there'll come a time when they have their last kiss, and one or the other dies. Their relationship is going to be limited. And even happy marriages are not perfect. All couples have irreconcilable differences. You might think when I talked about my wife at the beginning, like, oh, that poor guy is a terrible marriage. No, I think I have a good marriage. I think it's very normal in marriage to go through difficult times. And I think if you talk to anyone who's been married, more than 25 years, they'll say, yeah, there was this difficult time we went through. You could think about marriage a little bit like you think about your health. Are there some people who are born and go through their whole life, never get a serious illness, and then die at 100, never having had a serious illness? I suppose there might be some. But almost everyone gets sick once in a while, right? They get a cold, they get a flu, maybe even get something more serious like cancer or heart disease. Now that doesn't mean it's the end of their bodily well-being or their life. And the same thing is true of marriage. So the difference between couples that are miserable on the one hand and couples that get divorced, and on the other hand, couples that are happy, isn't having irreconcilable differences. It's rather how they deal with those differences. So we all seek perfect love, but we can't find that here below either. We want perfect goodness, perfect truth, perfect love, but there's only one who can give us those things. The one transcendent God. That's not something any human being can give to us. And positive psychology doesn't say anything for or against God. It just doesn't address that. God, after all, is not a material object. So God can't be studied with empirical means. Sometimes some people believe in this idea of scientism, where you say science and science alone gives us all knowledge. But I think that's a quite mistaken view, in part because science does not show that science and science alone provides all knowledge. Or maybe I'm mistaken about that. Anyone do a biology class, maybe do some dissection of frog or something like that? You ever do that? Yeah? So when you cut open the frog, you see behind the frog's liver or something like, science alone provides the truth. Was that stuck in there somewhere? No? Okay, well maybe in chemistry, right? You've got the Bunsen burner going, and you got a couple of Bunsen burners, and you mix up a potion, and out comes a cloud. Science alone provides the truth. Did that happen in science? No? Well, no, there's no scientific study that shows that science and science alone provides the truth. This is an example of a self-defeating statement. It's a little bit like if I say to you, I never, never, never say the word never. Well, I just said the word never several times. Or if I say to you, I don't speak English at all. Well, I said it in English. Or if I say to you, ich kann kein Wort auf Deutsch sagen. I just said in German, I don't speak German. I speak at least a little German, I just said it in German. So those are self-defeating statements. Bottom line is this. Positive psychology as a discipline is mostly dominated by people who aren't believers. And yet, even in this discipline, they came to understand by empirical means that basic Christian practices like gratitude, like forgiveness, like loving your neighbor, are psychologically beneficial for producing greater happiness. So again, this is not a theological doctrine, it is a psychological, empirical fact, at least if these studies are correct. So now, if what I said is true, you would expect that all people of faith would be super happy. But have you ever seen someone who seemed to be practicing their faith who clearly was miserable? Anyone ever see that? Someone with a big frown? Yeah, there are people like that. Sometimes that's me. Not always, hopefully, but sometimes. So what explains this? Well, I don't think it's hard to explain at all. Part of what positive psychology found is that people have different set points for happiness. So in other words, some people just genetically are born more upbeat, more cheerful, smiley, happy. That's just kind of the way they're built. And some people are just born with a temperament that's more dour, looking at the dark side of things, more pessimistic, gloomy, etc. So when you see someone who is practicing their faith that doesn't seem as happy as you might expect them to be, it could be that their temperament is one that just is initially more dour. Just like some people are born and their health isn't so good, and even if they exercise and follow the doctor's orders, still their health is going to be a little on the fritz. So some people just have a temperament that's more dour and sour and gloomy, and so even doing these positive things is not going to raise them to the level that maybe the average person would have. So that's one reason. The second reason, though, is this. There are people of faith that don't actually do what Jesus recommends. There are all kinds of people who are maybe physically in church, but who do not forgive their neighbor, who do not love their neighbor. These people would be a little bit like someone who goes to a doctor and gets a prescription, says, "Oh, doctor, thanks very much. This will be great for my asthma. Thanks for the prescription." They go home, put it behind the mirror, never take the medication. Well, it's not the doctor's fault or the medication's fault if you don't take it. So part of the reason some people of faith are less happy than they otherwise could be is they aren't actually following these principles. They don't, for instance, love their enemies. That is, of course, a very hard teaching. And I think we probably can all think in our lives of people that are our enemies and think about how hard it is to love them. But I'd like you to try, just as an experiment, try praying for them. And not praying, "God, may your wrath come down upon them," just as it did in ancient times where you destroyed whole cities. No, not like that. No, pray for their well-being. Let's say the person's name is Frank. And Frank was a total jerk to you, right? Trashed your reputation, punched you in the face, stole your phone, broke your, this was terrible. Try praying, "God, please bless Frank. Fill Frank's heart with love. Help Frank to find a fantastic person to marry. Help Frank to find a fantastic job." Try praying really sincerely for that person's well-being. It'll be hard, but I think you'll be surprised at the results. Try it for about a week. See what happens. So, some Christians don't, in fact, follow the advice of Jesus about loving your enemies, about praying for those who persecute you, about giving food to the hungry, clothing to the naked, welcoming the stranger. They just ignore those things. Well, again, if you don't follow the recommendations of the doctor, including the good doctor, you are not going to get the results the good doctor intended for you to have. But imagine many of you, maybe almost all of you, are not in a situation where you don't know the right thing to do, but rather you're in a situation that I often find myself in, where I do know what I ought to do, but I have trouble actually doing it in the moment. And this is called, by Thomas Aquinas, weakness of will. The idea would be you know the right thing to do, and you want to do it, but then you get in the moment, and all of a sudden, oh shoot, you're not doing it, right? So there are some people, of course, that do wrong simply out of malice, right? They're like, I don't care, I'm just going to be mean, and okay. There are some people like that, and there are some people who do wrong and they're ignorant. There's something they could have known about, and they should have known about, and they didn't bother knowing about it, and they do something bad. But I do think the most typical problem for most people is not malice, like they don't care at all, and it's not weakness of, or it's not ignorance, they have no clue, but rather it's weakness of will. So let me conclude my remarks today by giving some suggestions of things that we all can do to enhance our willpower, to help us to have greater willpower, so we have less weakness of will. Now, given human nature, we're never going to have perfect willpower. We're always going to have some willpower weaknesses here and there. So perfection here below is not going to happen for us, most likely, but we can improve. And so what can you do? Well, the first thing you can do is what Ignatius Loyola called agere contra, acting against. The idea of acting against is doing something. So if you think of a tree that should grow straight, but it's growing way too far to the right. Well, if that happened, what you'd have to do is get a rope around it, pull it back a little bit beyond straight, a little bit to the left, so that when you let go of the rope, then the tree's finally going straight. And the same thing is true with our characters. So for instance, let's say that you have inclination to seek pleasure too much. Wrong time, wrong way, etc. Well, you can correct that by doing things that are contra that. There's a word for that in the Catholic tradition. It's called mortification. What is mortification? Well, it just means doing something that you prefer not to do. For instance, maybe you like to have butter on your bread. Okay, maybe you don't have butter on your bread. Maybe you like to eat meat every day of the week, but maybe during Lent you don't eat meat on Fridays and don't eat meat on Wednesdays too. Maybe you like a nice warm shower. Well, you could have a nice cold shower. It will wake you up. It is also very trendy. You guys have, I'm sure, heard of this cold plunge trend. So again, secular society is catching up with these traditional Catholic things. The idea of all these practices is it's not that you're trying to harm yourself. No, that would be not at all a good mortification, but rather you're trying to correct yourself and strengthen yourself. Just like an athlete, if you're going to be good at sports, you need to train vigorously. You can't just sit on the couch and watch TV and be great basketball player or something. You need to train a lot. Do wind sprints. Toughen yourself up to get ready to run the race. So the idea here is that we can improve our willpower through these little mortifications. So here's a very small one that you can do pretty easily. You can, when you sit up straight. Good posture. That takes a little effort, but a little mortification. So the idea, again, is not that you sit on top of a pole for 40 days or something. It can be very small things that no one notices. That the whole point, though, is to strengthen your willpower, to do something against what you prefer, to make it easier for you to do what love actually demands when your time comes. A second thing that the positive psychologists found about strengthening willpower has to do with what we do in terms of, you might call it remote preparation. So, if you want to have good willpower, I strongly recommend getting a good night's sleep as often as you can. Now, we can't always control this, and as you have sleepless night, fine. But when you stay up every night till 2:30 in the morning drinking Red Bull, not going to be good for the willpower. It's going to undermine it. And the best way to get a good night's sleep, Andrew Huberman has taught us, is to get sun on your face in the morning. So you get out of bed, and not through the window, but right on your face, sun, and if it's a cloudy day, facing the direction where the sun is coming from, because photons actually are coming through the clouds, even though there's not direct sunlight coming through the clouds. And this sets your circadian rhythm so that you're more likely to have a good sleep that night. Another thing that positive psychology folks recommend for strengthening willpower is to eat well. I love In-N-Out. It's so good. But if I live on double-doubles and milkshakes and fries, my strength and willpower is going to be greatly depleted. So eating well is another thing that strengthens willpower. So all these things can be done remotely. So what about in the moment? You get a willpower challenge, you're trying not to do it. No, here I am, shoot, this thing is coming up, and I don't want to do it. Well, one thing you can remember is that the human mind is naturally restless. You have, I'm sure if you've ever prayed before, have this experience. You sit down to pray, your Eucharistic adoration or whatever, and you're like, okay, Jesus, here I am, I'm gonna pray. And God, and then you start thinking about lunch and, the football game and your aunt and all this stuff comes and oh no, Jesus, I'm back with you now, I'm back. Right? But then a few seconds later, you're thinking about lunch again, football game, whatever. This is just human nature. Right? We find it very, very hard to focus on one thing, have our mind on one thing. Now, this is bad if you're trying to pray and focus on God, but it's a good thing when you're tempted. So what you can know with absolute certainty is that all temptations come to an end. There's no temptation that lasts forever. The human mind and the human body just isn't built that way. So therefore you can't wait out the temptation. Now, one thing that doesn't work very well is to try to say to yourself, well, I'm not going to think about that. So we'll do testing. Okay, everyone, I want you not to think about purple elephants. Okay, to think about anything you want, but don't think about purple elephants, okay? How you doing? Purple elephants come to mind a little bit there? Yeah, of course. So you can't just will yourself not to think about purple elephants, because then you'll be thinking, am I thinking about purple elephants? No, I'm not. Yes, now I am thinking about purple elephants. Right? So you can think about it a little bit like a bear coming into a campground. So there's two things you do not want to do with the bears in a campground. The first would be to feed it. Why? What happens if you feed a bear at a campground? Say you're going to be there for 2 weeks or something. Yeah, you feed the bear, and all of a sudden here comes the mama bear, brother bear, cousin bear. Now you got a clan of bears there, right? So feeding the bear definitely is not going to work. But that's what sometimes people do if they have a temptation. They just give in. Oh, I'll just do it. And it'll go away. Well, yeah, but it comes back with all its bear friends. So that's not going to work. Another thing you don't want to do with the bear, though, is go out and fight the bear. Right? You don't want to go out there and say, like, bear, okay, I'm going to fight you. It's going to be, I know jiu-jitsu, so it's my jiu-jitsu against your claws, and we're going to see who wins. Well, that's not going to work out very well either. But sometimes people do this with temptation. I'm not going to think about the purple elephant. No purple elephants, no purple elephants. And of course, they think about purple elephants. So if the bear comes in the campground, what do? You don't feed it, and you don't fight it. You wait for it to walk away. And it will. The bear, if it is not given food, is going to just wander away. Might be a minute, might be 2 minutes. Most temptations don't last more than a couple minutes, and it'll wander away and be gone, and then no more bears. It'll be great. The bottom line, though, is this. All of us, at least sometimes, are going to fail. Through weakness of will, through malice, through a combination of things, we're all going to fail. But we're incredibly lucky as Catholics, because the fact is, everybody fails. Catholics fail, agnostics fail, atheists fail, everybody fails. But we as Catholics are so lucky because we have a way of dealing with our failures and dealing with our guilt. It's a little bit like everybody makes garbage. Right? You go through a day, you're going to make some garbage. You're going to eat a banana, well, then you got a banana peel left over. Right? You eat an apple, you got the apple core left over. People just do make garbage. People just do things that are wrong. But we as Catholics have a way of taking the garbage out, and it's called confession. Confession is our way of relieving ourselves of the burdens of garbage that we're carrying around. The guilt, the shame, the anxiety, I did this, I did that. Take out the garbage. We can take out the garbage most places every Saturday afternoon. And you might say, oh, I'm very embarrassed. I don't want to go in there and talk to Father, he'll see me around. If you're embarrassed, that's fine. Go to a different parish, go behind a screen, and speak in a very low voice so no one recognizes you. That's fine. You don't need to go face to face and with the priest you see all the time. Confession is a great way to be happy. It's a great way to be happy. It's a great way to be happy because it's a way of starting over. It's a way of starting over with God. It's a way of starting over with people in our lives that we've harmed or hurt their feelings. It's a way of starting over with ourselves. Because sometimes we are our own worst enemies. And we can beat up on ourselves and say, oh, I can't believe I did that. I'm so mad at myself. And that can be harmful to ourselves. And we should love ourselves. Why? Well, because we should love all human beings. Right? That's the teaching of Jesus. There's not Greek or Jew. There's not slave or free, there's not male or female, all are one in Christ. In other words, we all have this innate dignity, and therefore we all deserve to be loved. And love should begin at home. We should begin by loving ourselves, by doing what is really the best for ourselves. And for a lot of people, the way to start this is coming up. So coming up very soon, we have Lent. It is not my favorite season of the year, but it's my second favorite. My favorite is Advent. I love Advent the best, but Lent is second best because Lent is a chance to grow. Right? That's what this word means. In Middle English, the idea of Lent is growth. And that is our chance to grow. And arguably the best way to grow is start off with a good confession. And it may be a long time for you. It may be 5 years. Maybe you've gone to confession since your first confession when you were in 3rd grade. That's okay. I'll tell you a true story about confession. My wife's dad is gay. And he left the Catholic Church in 1971. And he was, living with a bunch of guys and doing all kinds of stuff. And we didn't see much of him because we were on the West Coast and he was living in New York. But a few years ago, we spent a year in Princeton. And Princeton and New York City are not far apart, so we'd go out there and see him every 3 weeks or so. And, during the course of the year, my wife's father got more and more sick. And at a certain point, we discovered that he was dying. And so the last time we saw him, we were moving back to Los Angeles from Princeton, and then he and his legal husband, Claudio, were moving to Uruguay, Claudio's home country. And so we were out on the street saying goodbye to each other, and Claudio said to me, he's very kind, he said, "Chris, I was terrified to meet you." He said, "I'm gay, I'm an atheist, I'm a Jew, and I thought you would hate me, but you've never been anything but kind and loving to me." And then Jennifer gave her dad, a kiss goodbye and a hug, and we moved back to Princeton and he moved to Uruguay. But Jennifer kept up with her dad and kept up with the nurse that was taking care of her dad. And the nurse told us that, told Jennifer, your dad's going to die very soon. And so I said to Jennifer, well, do you think maybe we should get a priest to go and give him last rites? And she goes, I don't know if we'll go for that, but I'll ask. So she talked to her dad and said, Dad, do you want a priest to come in and give you last rites? And he said, no, I'm not going to die. He said, okay, well, how about a priest to come in and pray with you and give you an anointing of the sick? He said, oh, yeah, I'll do that. So the priest came in, prayed with him, heard his confession, the first since about 1971, gave him last rites, gave him his last Holy Communion. And the last picture we have of him, just a couple days before he died, he's holding a crucifix that the priest had given him. And the nurse told us he wouldn't let go of the crucifix, that the nurse would just wash his hands around it. So I don't care if you've been away from confession for 50 years, now is the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kaiser. I especially love learning how science and faith don't contradict each other. Rather, faith complements psychology and elevates the empirical evidence that we have. The lecture was especially inspiring, Lent coming up about strengthening my own willpower, but also intentionally seeking out joy as part of the Lenten season. So, thank you.
At this point in time, we're going to have Dr. Kaiser answer some questions, and so we can start forming a line right here on this right side of the podium.
Hello. Hi. My name is Mateo. Thanks for the talk first. It was very interesting. It's very interesting how you analyzed and talked about positive psychology and analyzed it / compared it to the Christian faith specifically. So my question is, how could we do that same process of analyzing / comparing positive psychology and psychology in general with other religious faiths that on morality and behavior might look very similar to Christianity, but are different in their deeper philosophical beliefs. And do you think that could bring religions ultimately together or closer together? Or is there like some underlying danger into like maybe exposing one to be like more truthful than another?
Great, thank you. So there are psychological studies about a lot of other religions. So I would say the most common one that's studied is Buddhism. So there's a lot of research about Buddhism and psychological research about that. There is interesting overlaps though between Buddhism and Christianity in terms of what in Buddhism is called metta, but in Christianity would be called petitionary prayer. So what metta is thinking about basically wishing well wishes for others. So you're wishing yourself peace, harmony, goodness, wishing those close to you the same thing, and then kind of spreading outward. And that is similar in many ways to what Christians would call petitionary prayer, right? Where we say, God, please bless my wife, please bless my kids, please bless my parents, please bless my students. So it's a similar sort of thing. Now, I don't know if there's studies comparing the psychological outputs of metta with petitionary prayer. I'm just not aware if there's studies comparing those. So it'd be interesting to see what those say. On the question of truth, I do think that it is a matter of logic that not all religious views can be true. So either God exists or God doesn't exist. So if God does exist, then people who have a theistic view are correct. If God does not exist, well then atheists are correct. And then either there's just one God or there are many gods. And if there's just one God, then monotheistic views like Islam, Judaism, and Christianity are correct. But if there are many gods, and maybe like the Greek religion that had Zeus and Hera and a bunch of other gods, maybe those are correct. And then within monotheism, there are important differences. So Christianity obviously holds that Jesus is God from God, light from light, true God from true God. In other words, Jesus really is God. But Judaism doesn't think that, and Islam doesn't think that. So all those views can't be correct. Now, that's a different question, though, from the question of how socially beneficial a religious practice is. So it could be the case that those things are differentiated, but it may be the case that they're not. So I'll give you an example. There are some Mormon practices that are very healthy. So Mormons, if they follow the church's code, don't drink any alcohol. And there's benefits on average from not drinking any alcohol. In part because so many people don't drink moderately that people, if they don't drink any alcohol, there'd be a lot of people, if they drank at all, would become alcoholics and then have terrible health problems, all kinds of problems. So Mormonism, I think, clearly, as a religious practice, has some health benefits. Now, does that mean that Mormonism is true? Well, no, I don't think Mormonism is true. So there, the doctrinal truths that the religion teaches and the practical beneficial effects are different. Now, if someone followed Catholic teaching and only drank a moderate amount of alcohol, well, that would, they would be an alcoholic and ruin their liver and things like that if they were moderate. But again, the trouble is there's a lot of people who find it extremely difficult to be moderate. And so for those people, hopefully they realize, okay, I just can't drink it all. Because for me, I can't have, 2 beers. 2 beers turns into 18 beers, 20 beers, and passed out and doing crazy things. So you can see there how, for not everyone, some people are very moderate, their whole life's great. But for some people, it seems to be very wise to be like, I'm just not going to make it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kaiser, for your talk. I had a question about sort of the psychology of happiness, particularly, is there a way that psychology can distinguish for us between sort of maybe an earthly or more material happiness versus sort of like the deep, almost heavenly joy that you see in sort of the martyr and ascetic saints?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, there is. So you could think about the distinction between perma, like Seligman talks about, on the one hand, and joy. So perma I've already spoken about, but what would joy be? Joy would be having actual union with God and therefore enjoying or rejoicing in God. Now that's compatible with very terrible sufferings in other respects. So in other words, you could have somebody who has joy but actually doesn't have positive emotion because they're so sad about getting scourged, let's say. You could have someone who has joy but doesn't have engagement because they're in prison or something. Could you have joy and not have meaning? No, I think those probably do go together, because if you really are united with God and you think you can serve God even if you were, say, locked up in prison, and you can serve God even if you were suffering, that seems to me you still could have meaning. And then achievement, that seems to me you could have very low achievement and still have joy. So you fail to, I don't know, get your candidate elected to office. You fail to finish your dissertation. You fail to do whatever it is you're trying to do. Well, you can still have joy. So I do think those are distinct. And joy, again, would be the idea of an actual union with God. And joy would be imperfect in this life, because in this life, no one sees God face to face. No one has perfect union with God. And that joy would be brought to perfection, not in this life, but in the life to come.
Thank you for the talk, Dr. Kaiser. My question comes from popular psychology and counseling programs such as like Alcoholics Anonymous. They use the 12-step program, starting from the baseline of acknowledging that people are powerless to face their addiction and need the help of a higher power or a God. And you mentioned in your talk that positive psychology has so few people who are theists or people of faith, yet their findings are confirming many of the practices of Christianity. So my question is, why do you think there are so few theists in the field of psychology and counseling?
Yeah, so there's an unfortunate trend that there are some fields that get unbalanced, you might say. So it's true religiously, but it can also be true politically. So if you look at various fields, in some fields you do find a greater diversity in terms of religious and political views, and in other fields you find almost a complete homogeneity, where you get everybody more or less having the same view. So I don't want to misrepresent things. There definitely are people of faith that are positive psychologists. In fact, the guy who edits a journal of positive psychology, the leading journal in the field, is a strong Christian, Robert Emmons. So there definitely are. But, and again, this is an impression. So it may be inaccurate, but my impression is that a lot of the people that practice this are just not people of faith. So for instance, Seligman himself. Seligman himself is kind of an agnostic, maybe a kind of deist. His religious views, I haven't read that much about it, but I've read some of them, and they seem to be not very well thought out. Now, what accounts for that? I think a variety of factors. I think that academia is somewhat prejudicial against people of faith, so that, not that it's impossible, but that you've got to kind of strike against you if you're a person of faith, at least if you're open about it. Now, if you're closeted and people have no idea, okay, well, that's okay. But I do think that there's depending on the field, a more or less greater or lesser bias against those kinds of people. So just to use a different factor. I was at a talk about positive psychology, and I happened to be sitting right next to Martin Seligman, and the talk was given by Jonathan Haidt, famous psychologist from NYU. And he said, how many people here, as psychologists mostly, how many people here would describe themselves as socially conservative? And there was only 2 hands raised in the whole thing, 40, 50 people. And then how many people would describe themselves as socially liberal? It was like all of them. Now that actually does have an influence, I think, on religious faith, because there's a correlation, again, I'm not thinking causation, but a correlation between political views and religious belief and practice. So if all you know about somebody is that they are a person who practices faith in a serious way, the likelihood, the probability the person would describe themselves as more conservative goes up. Now those people have a very difficult time in psychology because, again, the field is completely dominated by the other side. Now again, it's not impossible. Seligman himself, very famous psychologist, head of the American Psychological Association, he describes himself as a social conservative, but that's really pretty rare. And I think that's really to the detriment of psychology, as Jonathan Haidt pointed out in different ways.
Thank you. Could you comment on the relationship between like happiness and truth?
Yeah.
What maybe positive psychology has to say about it versus faith?
Yeah, so the positive psychology folks, I don't think have addressed that question of happiness and truth very much. But a person who did a lot on that was Thomas Aquinas. And his way of thinking about it is that for humans to be happy, our happiness has to correspond to who we are. So the kind of happiness that we can achieve is different than what a dog could have, or a cat, or a tree or something. So because we have minds, our minds naturally seek the truth. And so for us, we can't find happiness ultimately outside of the truth, because our minds are geared towards the truth, and therefore if we don't get the truth, we're just not going to be happy. So it'd be a little bit like saying our stomachs are geared toward digesting food. So if we don't digest food, we're going to have upset stomachs, we're going to feel weak, we're going to feel sick, etc., because our bodies are geared towards that. So Aquinas thought, and here he's following Aristotle, that our minds just are oriented to try to seek the truth. And therefore, we can't find satisfaction, at least perfect satisfaction, until we do have a perfect relationship with the truth. And that's what Aquinas thought that heaven was all about. Heaven's all about knowing the truth as perfectly as we can, and loving the good as perfectly as we can, and having a loving community. So it's not just us and God, but it's the angels and saints, us, those that we love, all in a city of God, all in a community of love. So that's how Aquinas at least thought of heaven.
Hi, Doctor. Thank you so much on enlightening us on the aspect of forgiveness that we need in order to pursue happiness. So with my question, I was wondering about a much more situational after effect of forgiveness in correlation with like people who have undergone a lot of psychological abuse as well. So for instance, like in cases like sexual abuse, child abuse, or like prisoners of war, like there are people who have like undergone a lot of trauma from those different aspects of their lives. And like, of course, like we should forgive those, but does that mean that we have to let them back into our lives because of the abuse that was undergone to them, because it seems like it would be detrimental to their happiness?
Yeah, that's a good question. So let me define what I mean by forgiveness. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting about what happened. Because if someone does something horrible to you, it's really catastrophic, you'll never forget unless you get Alzheimer's. You'll always remember somebody chopping off your arm or something terrible. So it's not forgetting. It's also not foregoing justice. So if somebody does something terrible to you, kidnaps you, chops off your arm, sexually molests you, something horrible, you can and should seek justice. And what does that mean? Well, there's a difference between justice and vengeance. So vengeance would be, you did this terrible thing to me, I'm going to get back at you, I'm going to wait outside your house with a shotgun, and when you leave to go to the grocery store, I'm going to shoot you in the head. That's vengeance. That's definitely unforgiveness. But what is seeking justice? Well, seeking justice would be, you committed a crime. Because you committed a crime, it is part of defending the common good to have the police involved. So, for instance, if you have a wife whose husband is beating her up or something, she should call the police. Why? Well, because if she calls the police, presumably the police will be able to stop him from doing that. And that helps her. And it actually helps him too. It's not loving and helpful to allow someone to do evil to you. Right? So you may have to call the police, and that's totally compatible with forgiveness. So what is forgiveness? Well, forgiveness is foregoing personal vengeance against the person, treating the person with fundamental dignity. And that is 100% compatible with not allowing a person into your life. So clearly, if someone's crazy, if someone's abusing you, if someone's hitting you and hurting you, you may have to have no contact with the person for the rest of your life because the person's crazy and they always try to kill you every time they see you. That's sad, but you may have to get a restraining order and have them put in prison if it's really serious, whatever it is. But that is totally compatible with forgiveness. Because again, forgiveness has to do with, or unforgiveness, is seeking personal vengeance. That's when you take justice into your own hands and say, you did this to me, well, I'm going to go after you. I'm going to, shoot you in revenge. Okay, well, that's definitely unforgiveness. But it is totally compatible with forgiveness, and indeed a good idea, often, if someone is terrible and abusive and dangerous, to no longer have any contact with the person. Because again, if you're putting your life in danger, well, that you should love yourself and protect yourself too. And so you may have to, again, get a restraining order, call the police, make sure that there's, no contact at all between the two of you. But that's totally compatible with also forgiving. Because forgiving is something that helps the person who's been wronged. If you're eaten up with unforgiveness, that harms you. So it's a little bit like this. If you have unforgiveness, it's like you're holding a bunch of burning hot coals and you're getting ready to throw it in the person's face. Take personal revenge on them. But the trouble is, if you're holding a bunch of burning hot coals, you're getting burnt. So forgiveness is letting go of those burning hot coals and saying, you know what? I'm not going to take personal vengeance on this person. God will take care of it. The police will take care of it. I'm not going to take justice into my own hands to take care of it. I may not be able to contact them anymore. I may not have to see them anymore. That's fine. But I'm not taking personal vengeance on them. Good question. No.
Hi, Doctor. Thank you for your talk. You may be interested to know there's also a body of scholarship out there called Positive Organizational Scholarship that takes a lot of those same ideas that Sullivan did and goes it up to an organizational level. My question is around, oftentimes in society today, being smart seems to be affiliated and associated with being cynical or being negative. And how can we counter that and show that you can be smart by being positive and perhaps using our faith in that argument?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that's a kind of cognitive bias. So there's a lot of cognitive biases that people have, for instance, with respect to being more attuned to negativity. So if we have 5 interactions and 4 of them are positive but one's negative, it's highly likely you'll remember the negative interaction and kind of forget about the 4 positive interactions. And so too, I think that there's a kind of bias, a thought that someone who's critical or cynical is actually showing a great deal of understanding and is really smart. But I think that's more shown than reality. I think to be smart is what? Well, it's to actually know what's true. And that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with being cynical, right? It has to do with you're actually being in contact with reality. So I think it's sort of like a cheap way of appearing smart, right? But appearing smart and actually being smart are 2 distinct things. You can give off all kinds of appearances, and that doesn't necessarily give the reality of what's at play. So in reality, to have knowledge involves contact with reality. Actually knowing whatever it is that you actually know. Not just shooting people down and being sarcastic and glib, even though that gives kind of the appearance of being smart.
You mentioned how as humans, our happiness consists of knowing. I was hoping you could expand on the dynamic between knowing and loving, because it also seems we're called to love. And if you can be happy only loving, or if you can be happy only knowing things, or if it's even possible to separate those things, or are they kind of intimately bound?
Yeah, I would say that love and truth are intimately bound. Edith Stein talked about this. She said, don't accept anything as love unless it has truth, and don't accept anything as truth unless it has love. So these 2 things go together. Why? Well, because ultimately, at the most foundational level, truth and love are the same thing. God is both truth and love. So love and truth ultimately do go together. And even love, thought about in an everyday human way, truth and love go together. So if I'm going to love you, that's going to involve 3 things. It's going to involve me willing your good for your sake. It's going to involve me appreciating who you are. And it's going to involve me seeking unity with you in appropriate ways. But all 3 of those involve the truth. So first of all, willing what's good for you. That presupposes that I know what's actually good for you. So maybe you're addicted to crack or something, and you're like, hey, help me get my crack. Well, I would say that's not actually good for you. It's not actually loving to give a crack addict more drugs. That's not loving. So to really love someone, we have to really know what actually is good for them and then help them get those things that are actually good for them. Things like friendship, knowledge, etc. And then secondly, appreciation. That's part of love. If I really love you, I appreciate the reality of who you are. So let's say I'm friends with you and I love you. And I'm like, you know what? You make a great Queen of England. You're amazing. You're so, regal, Queen Elizabeth II. I love how you sit on the throne. And I go on complimenting you like you're the Queen of England. Well, you're not the Queen of England, right? So if I'm complimenting the Queen of England, to you, I'm just not understanding who you are. Now, I don't know you, but if I got to know you, presumably I could appreciate the actual person you are, right? Whatever's true, whatever's noble, whatever's just, whatever's honorable. If there's any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, I can think about those things in you. I don't know what those things are. I don't know you. But maybe a good sense of humor, maybe you're kind, maybe you're good at basketball, maybe you throw a good fastball, maybe you're a good son, maybe you're a good grandson. I don't know. But love, if I loved you, I'd appreciate the reality of who you are. And that's going to differ from person to person. So the reality of who you are is different from who you are, and it's different from who you are. And that's why love is always individualized. Yes, there's some common things that we share. Obviously there are, like knowledge is good for all of us, friendship is good for all of us. But in terms of appreciating someone, part of what makes love distinctive is you appreciate what's distinctive about this person. And to know that, we have to get to know the person, the reality, the truth of who this person is. And then the final part of love, I think, is seeking unity. And again, I don't know you, but I'm guessing there could be ways in which, if we were friends, we could be unified together in our friendship. So maybe you like to go sailing, so we sail together. You like to do jujitsu, so we do that together. You like to go to the movies, so we go to the movies together. But the idea is, you do some kind of activities together that unify the two of us, let's say. And then in other kinds of relationships, you're unified in other kinds of ways. So think about marriage. A husband and wife are unified in making children and then hopefully unified in raising those children. So they share life together, raising their children. That's what unifies them. So depending on, and say, a parent with a child, they're unified and the parent is unified with the kid, helping the kid to grow up. So all love involves those things, but all those things involve the reality. Right? The reality of the one that you love. If I love you as if you're my son, well, that's not really loving you at all, because you're not my son. Right? Real love has to be based on reality, the truth about who you are, the truth about who I am, the truth about our relationship with each other. And then it's real love, as opposed to fake love. So fake love lacks all those things. Right? You don't will the real good for the person, you just give them whatever you think they want, or whatever, you give them whatever is going to get you what you want. That's actually what happens usually. And you don't appreciate the reality of who they are, the actual good that they are, right? You give them fake praise. Oh, you're the best basketball player of all time. No, you're not. Unless your name's Michael Jordan, you're not the best basketball player of all time. Sorry. Right? And then you're unified in ways that are truthful, fitting, appropriate for your relationship. So love and truth, I think, always go together. And any time these are set against each other, I think you're neglecting, well, I don't think you can have actual love without truth. I just don't think you can have that.
Thanks for the thought. The question about the positive psychology and how the positive psychology define happiness and how you define happiness.
So positive psychology defines happiness. There's a bunch of different scholars. The most prominent, I think, is Martin Seligman. He's the one who kind of founded the whole movement. And he defines happiness in terms of positive emotion, engagement, relationship, meaning, and achievement. So that's how he defines it. There are other positive psychology folks who define happiness in a purely subjective way. So they say the satisfaction of whatever desire it is that you have. I think that's a horrible way of defining happiness, in part because your desires are shaped by your character. So if you have a terrible, vicious character, you will desire to do vicious, terrible things. And that's actually bad for you. It's a bad thing to do vicious, terrible things. It corrupts you further, makes your character worse, and moves you even further away from happiness. So I don't think it's a good way to think about what happiness is, to say, well, it's whatever satisfies your desires, because if you have vicious, terrible desires, you're just going to make things actually worse for yourself. So obvious example would be someone who's addicted to drugs, right? They deeply desire more drugs. Okay, is that good for them, in fact, in reality, to get more and more drugs? No. It makes it worse and worse and worse for them. So we can't count on our desires and say, well, whatever I desire is automatically good, unless we're fully virtuous. So I don't know if you've read recently Dante's Divine Comedy. In the Purgatorio, Virgil has been guiding him all the way up the mountain of Purgatorio. And when he gets to the very end, Virgil says, now I'm going to leave you. Now your desires are perfected. I crown you and lord you, Lord of yourself. The idea is now Dante finally has his desires perfected. So he wants what actually is good. And now if what you want is what's actually good, fantastic. Follow your every desire. Because if that's true, your every desire would be for what is actually good, actually loving, actually helpful to you, actually helpful to others, actually serving God. Fantastic. And that's what someone who has been perfected would have. They would have perfected desires and be great to follow them. But if you're not perfect, then following your desires is a recipe for destruction. Because all of us have a mix. I doubt anyone here, if they're honest, says, I'm perfectly good in every respect. Every desire I have is 100% great. All of us have selfish, rude, misshapen desires. And so if we enhance those, we're going to go down the wrong road.
Well, that's about all the time we have for questions. Thank you again, Dr. Quezar, for your contribution to the Newman Lecture Series and for all the years of work educating us on psychology and the faith. And if you have any final few words just to say.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for making time to come to the lecture. I really appreciate that. And I hope that you have a fantastic Lent and you grow all through Lent to become more and more happy, and that you, on Easter, have your best Easter ever. Thanks.
We have also just a few announcements. So first we want to give a special thank you to all of our sponsors whose support makes these intellectual conversations possible, along with all that we do at the Newman Center. So thank you.
And if you enjoyed tonight's conversation, please stay tuned for our lecture that will take place in the spring.